The Honorable, the Chief Justice, and the Associate Justices of the Supreme Court of the United States. Oyez! 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 All persons having business before the Honorable, the Supreme Court of the United States, are admonished to draw near and give their attention, for the court is now sitting. God save the United States and this honorable court.
We will now hear argument in number 231141, Smith & Wesson Brands versus Estados, Unidos, Mexicanos. Ms. Rolla?
Madam Chief Justice, and may it please the court. The questions before this court today are whether U.S. firearm manufacturers can be held liable for cartel violence in Mexico, either as the proximate cause of harm or for allegedly aiding and abetting illegal trafficking simply because some guns are unlawfully smuggled. Imagine a car manufacturer being sued because criminals use their vehicles as getaway cars. This case against Smith & Wesson is just that, an attempt to hold a lawful American company responsible for actions far beyond its control. Smith & Wesson follows every aspect of U.S. law. Its firearms are manufactured in Massachusetts and Tennessee, sold to federally licensed distributors, and purchased by consumers who pass thorough background checks. Once a legally purchased firearm is smuggled into Mexico, Smith & Wesson's involvement ends. The opposition will argue that Smith & Wesson's advertising targets drug cartels. This claim is not only false, but deeply prejudiced. 11% of the U.S. population is Mexican, making up 59% of all Hispanic Americans. To suggest that marketing to Mexicans is equivalent to marketing to cartels is an offensive and unfounded generalization. Smith & Wesson does not sell directly in Mexico. If firearms reach the country, it's simply through illegal smuggling, something Mexican authorities have failed to control. Instead of addressing internal corruption and cartel influence, Mexico seeks to scapegoat an American company. With an impunity rate of 93%, its own justice system has failed to combat organized crime. Meanwhile, this lawsuit threatens American industries, opening the door for foreign governments to hold U.S. businesses responsible for the criminal misuse of their products. The law is clear. The Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act prevents lawsuits exactly like these. If allowed to proceed, this case would set a dangerous precedent, undermining American businesses and legal protections. Your Honor, we urge this court to dismiss this case and uphold the principles that protect lawful commerce. Thank you. We welcome the court's questions.
How do you respond to Mexico's allegations that your company deliberately facilitates gun trafficking into Mexico by maintaining a distribution system that enables illegal sales despite being aware of specific distributor and dealer networks disproportionately associated with such trafficking?
Your Honor, I just want to clarify, you're asking how we enable distribution into Mexico? Yes. So as I mentioned, Smith & Wesson, our client, has various exchange of hands before a firearm reaches the end user. So first, Smith & Wesson, the company, manufactures firearms, and then they are sold to distributors who then pick a retail store and distribute to the retail store.
Right, and what specific measures, if any, does Smith & Wesson implement in order to prevent this illegal trafficking into Mexico?
So all the distributors are federally licensed, and every purchase, the consumer has a thorough background check conducted by the national standards.
Just comments?
So in your view, does manufacturer such as Smith & Wesson only face liability if directly causing harm, or could there be cases where indirect actions matter?
Yeah, so in this case, we're looking at proximate cause, and if there's a direct link between Smith & Wesson and their manufacturing of firearms and the harm committed by the drug cartels in Mexico with these firearms. So in this case, there is no direct link. As you asked in your question, yes, there is a direct link. If Smith & Wesson was directly supplying firearms to these drug cartels in Mexico, then that would be a case for liability. But in this case, Smith & Wesson is simply manufacturing the firearms, and then all their other processes are legal, and those firearms are being illegally trafficked into Mexico.
So knowing that these firearms can be easily trafficked or given to the distributors, wouldn't that suggest more than a purely indirect role?
So Smith & Wesson is entirely a gun manufacturing company. We have no business in the U.S. Government or regulating the distribution of firearms. We only sell and comply with national standards for gun manufacturing and selling to our distributors. After the gun is smuggled into Mexico, please remember that Mexico has very strict gun laws. So no Smith & Wesson firearms are directly sold in Mexico. The only way they reach Mexico is through illegal smuggling. And this looks back poorly upon the Mexican Border Control, who is not doing enough due diligence to look into why this many guns have come into their country.
Justice Alito?
So if a manufacturer becomes aware that a significant portion of its products are being trafficked illegally, should the manufacturer take additional measures to prevent misuse?
I don't believe this is the case. As Smith & Wesson as a manufacturing company, as would be the same for any other manufacturing company, it's not their responsibility to oversee every single transaction and activity that is happening between the distributors and the purchasers of these firearms. Once again, that is up to these distributors who must have federal licenses that, again, are obtained by the federal government. So it is not the manufacturer of Smith & Wesson it's not their responsibility to ensure that all of these guns are ending up with the right people, because they are not the ones directly selling to the people who purchase these firearms.
So if we were to rule in your favor, would you guys take any additional measures or add any additional measures to prevent this problem?
So the primary problem in this situation is the consumer buying the firearm and the smuggling into the country. So there's a type of purchase called a straw purchase, and that's where a person with a clean background purchases a firearm for traffickers. So that is, again, not at our level. That's a third party, and the firearm has now exchanged hands 3 times, so that no longer complies with the responsibilities of the gun manufacturer itself. So the policies we would hope to see would be in the retail stores, in our distributors, and more.
Justice Sotomayor? You argue Mexico's claims infringe on the Second Amendment and gun rights, but where is their precedent that grants corporations Second Amendment protections?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah. So you argue that Mexico's claims infringe on gun rights, but where's their precedent that a corporation has Second Amendment protections?
So we're not necessarily, thank you for the question, we're not necessarily saying that Mexico is infringing upon the Second Amendment. We're saying that these firearms, they have protection in the Constitution under the Second Amendment. They also have protection through the PLCAA. And in that case, there are still all these legal processes, again, as we've explained before, that the Smith & Wesson has to go through in order for these firearms to end up in the hands of the people who are purchasing them. So we're not saying that Mexico is infringing upon our Second Amendment rights. We're just saying that it's not the responsibility of Smith & Wesson to be connected, to be the aiding and abetting in these crimes committed by the drug cartels in Mexico.
Justice Kagan?
So how do you address the perception that your company is marketing and distributing practices are intended to attract criminal elements, thus contributing to violence in Mexico?
Yes, thank you for your question, Your Honor. So there's a gun that Smith & Wesson produces called the El Jefe, and that firearm is marketed towards Mexican Americans in the United States. As I mentioned before, 11% of the U.S. population is Mexican, and 59%, that is 59% of all Hispanic Americans. So to say that marketing this weapon to cartels, or to Mexicans, means marketing this weapon to cartels is a very prejudiced generalization towards all Mexican American people. We are simply, or our clients are simply marketing towards Mexican Americans.
And how would you interpret the scope of the PLCAA concerning claims arising from foreign jurisdictions, particularly in light of its applications to alleged harms occurring outside the United States?
So I think in this case, as the PLCAA is an American law, I think that in this case, yes, it is up to the jurisdiction, and that's why we're having this hearing today. But in this case, with the PLCAA, it says that if they're specifically engaged in the distribution, the PLCAA protects those manufacturer companies of these firearms, and saying that any crimes committed by their firearms that they produce, they can't be held liable for that. However, the predicate exception to this is that if there is a direct link between Smith & Wesson and their manufacturing, if they're explicitly marketing to these drug cartels, then that would be a case for potential liability. But again, in this case, as Smith & Wesson is not directly marketing or targeting or distributing to the Mexican drug cartels, then they cannot be held liable. In another case, if it was another foreign country and Smith & Wesson was directly contributing to these crimes and aiding and abetting in them, then they could be held liable. But again, that is not the case in this situation.
Justice Gorsuch.
So Smith & Wesson produces several firearms, one of which you have already named, the El Jefe gun, and evidence suggests that the firearm itself is posing a risk to your company in itself, Smith & Wesson. My question is, why would Smith & Wesson continue to produce this firearm if it poses a risk to their company's well-being?
So, as our team has mentioned before, the El Jefe weapon and weapons alike to that weapon are produced by Smith & Wesson to appeal to the Mexican-American population in the U.S. 11% of the American population is Mexican, and that's 1/10 of our country. So, Smith & Wesson is specifically marketing towards those Americans when making this gun. It's no way dangerous to us. It's the end user, how they choose to use the weapon is not a reflection on how Smith & Wesson manufactured the weapon. We manufacture all our weapons, and Smith & Wesson sells every weapon with a gun safety tutorial and check to make sure that it complies with the state regulation and the regulation of using a firearm appropriately.
And given your role as a manufacturer of firearms that are frequently trafficked across the United States-Mexico border, what specific measures has your company implemented to monitor and prevent your products from being put into the hands of criminal organizations? And how do you ensure that your distributors and retailers are not contributing to this illegal flow of firearms?
Yes, thank you for your question, Your Honor. So Smith & Wesson first manufactures the weapon in both Massachusetts and Tennessee, and then the weapon is sold to federally licensed distributors. So it's important to note that once the firearm goes from the manufacturing agency to the distributor, the firearm is no longer under Smith & Wesson's domain. So the firearm is now in the hands of the distributor, and the distributor has chosen licensed retail shops where they can sell the firearm, and from there, the firearm is purchased by a consumer who passed thorough background checks by national standards. And to imply that Smith & Wesson is involved in the trafficking would not be warranted, because the end user, the consumer, is purchasing from a retail store, which is separate from the manufacturer, and the manufacturer is Smith & Wesson, so that would be upon the policies of each individual retail store.
Why wouldn't you change the design of the gun if you know that it's going to end up eventually, in some cases, in the Mexican cartel hands?
So, Your Honor, are you referring to a specific gun or all of our firearms?
Each gun that ends up in the Mexican cartels, why wouldn't you change the design even though it's meant for the Mexican Americans inside the USA? Why not take other precautions in order to change the end goal?
Thank you, Your Honor. So while, as I mentioned earlier, it is not Smith & Wesson's responsibility to oversee every single transaction and illegal activity that is occurring within the United States and across the Mexican border. Saying that, I think we can look at this from any manufacturer or company standpoint. Obviously, in terms of cars, we have people who get into car accidents who, are under the influence while they're driving. If we were to say to those car companies, you can't produce any more cars because potentially some few bad people could misuse your product, then that's the precedent that this case is setting. It's saying that any American company can be held liable for some violent crimes committed by their product. And as the TLCA protects the misuse of firearms, in this case, we can't just stop making all of our weapons. Smith & Wesson can't just stop any of its transactions because some of these weapons are falling into the hands of the wrong people. And that's why we need to improve the border patrol between Mexico and the United States to ensure that these firearms are not being illegally trafficked into Mexico and to reduce the harm caused by these firearms. Right?
Justice Kavanaugh?
Similar firearm manufacturers have argued that they cannot be sued for the actions of a third party. However, Remington settled a lawsuit over its marketing of the AR-15 used in the Sandy Hook shooting. How is this case different? Because you're both arguing that, both of the arguments were that the marketing practices caused unlawful use of firearms.
Your Honor, are you asking how this case is similar to that case, or are you asking how our marketing is similar or different?
I'm asking how is this case different from that, because in both of your arguments, in Remington and Smith and Wesson, you're arguing that your marketing didn't encourage unlawful use, and that you don't have any responsibility for the third-party actions.
Yeah, so in the case with Remington and the victims of the families of Cindy and shooting, in that case, it was very much proven that Remington was marketing its firearms in a way that was attracting people to use their weapons. I don't remember the exact wording of the advertisement, but it was essentially saying that if you owning a firearm was indicative of manhood, and clearly you can see from that statement, from that marketing, that it was trying to get people to purchase their firearms by saying, maybe you're less of a man by having those firearms. But if you were to look at Smith & Wesson's marketing, there's no case of that. There's no case of discriminating against people, saying that if you don't have a firearm, it doesn't make you any less of a person or anything like that. We don't have any marketing. In fact, we have very few categories that we are marketing our firearms under. So in that case, that marketing was different because it was very much proven that, in that case, Remington was trying to appeal to younger users. Some of their users were, the way they marketed their guns was like a third-party shooter in a video game, and their marketing was very different from the marketing we have at Smith & Wesson.
Thank you.
Justice Coney Barrett.
See, if we were to rule in your favor, that would essentially mean that U.S. corporations could never be held liable in U.S. courts for harms that they facilitate abroad. So are you asking us to establish a blanket rule that no foreign government has any standing in cases involving American companies?
So no, our client is not asking for a blanket rule to cover any liabilities that an American company has proven in another country. However, in this case, there is no liability on Smith & Wesson because, in fact, our client is a gun manufacturer, and the gun passing hands through the exchange, getting down to the end user, the customer, gets to the customer legally and then passes through the border illegally. In another case, if there was enough evidence to claim that the manufacturer or the American company was directly causing harm to another country, that would warrant such a rule. But however, in this case, it's extremely different. One example would be like oil spills in another country. If an American company is going and digging oil, or they're digging through reserves, and they've caused the other country significant natural harm, that's obviously a very different issue, and we would hope that the court would look at that in a separate way.
So you would agree that if it was shown that marketing strategies and practices by Smith & Wesson are shown to incentivize in regions where gun trafficking was very prevalent, that Smith & Wesson would take responsibility for the damages? Yes or no?
Yeah, I think if there was a direct link between the Smith & Wesson's marketing or manufacturing and the harm caused by the drug cartels in Mexico, then that could be a case for liability. But again, in this case, we have the proximate cause, and as we're looking through, there's way too many third parties and intervening causes coming to this. Smith & Wesson, the firearms start by being manufactured by Smith & Wesson. They pass through the hands of distributors, retailers, and then those straw producers are those people who are illegally smuggling firearms. But again, in this case, there's too many intervening causes to prove that there is a proximate cause, and that is why Smith & Wesson cannot be held liable in this court.
Justice Jackson.
So if a gun manufacturer knowingly knows that they're marketing and selling firearms in a way that appeals to criminals, why is that not a form of aiding and abetting?
So if a gun manufacturer knew and they were knowingly marketing to a cartel in another country, that would be illegal. However, that's not the case in this case, because our client, Smith & Wesson, is simply marketing to Mexican Americans, which make up 11% of the U.S. population. And this marketing also goes beyond it doesn't appeal to cartel violence and cartels, because there's 5 main areas that Smith & Wesson markets to, and that's home defense, competition in terms of sporting with firearms, concealed carry, because some states allow the wider Second Amendment scope, and recreation hunting, which is allowed in the United States.
And then, hypothetically speaking, if the U.S. government had warned you that your guns were being sold to these cartels and you didn't change anything, should that not matter?
So yeah, in the case of the federal government, as they're the ones regulating these distributors and making sure that they have their licenses so they're able to legally distribute these firearms, then in that case, obviously, if the federal government were to revoke their licenses because they were proved that there were red flag purchases, or that they were engaging in illegal activities or not taking the measures to prevent these firearms from Smith & Wesson would pull out of those distributors and not perform business with them anymore, because then Smith & Wesson itself would be not following federal law, because Smith & Wesson's responsibility is to ensure that they are working with distributors who have these federal licenses. So if those federal licenses are taken away, then Smith & Wesson will no longer be able to work with those distributors.
So you previously directed a part of the issue being Mexico's border control and not doing their own due diligence in managing the distribution of trafficked firearms through the borders. So, but would this not contradict Smith & Wesson not doing their own due diligence into the tracing of how your distributors do business?
So Smith & Wesson does do a abundance of due diligence in terms of where the gun is, or the firearm is tracked to. However, once the gun leaves the manufacturing agency or the manufacturing center, it goes to a distributor, and the distributor is no longer associated with Smith & Wesson. So Smith & Wesson has completed a transaction to the distributor, which is strictly legal because they are a federally licensed distributor, and they have just given the firearms over to the distributor. And now from here, the distributor can choose which retail stores to sell the gun at, and then the end user can come, who has a background check, and they can buy the firearm from that retail store.
How do you respond that you receive over 170 annually from sales of guns trafficked into Mexico, despite losing the connection once you give your guns over to the distributor?
Yeah, so again, kind of answering what we said before, again, those distributors, that is not Smith & Wesson's fault that these distributors are engaging or potentially marketing or distributing their weapons to people where it ends up in the wrong hands.
But you still profit off of that.
Yes, but that is not our. We don't have the ability to regulate and oversee every single transaction. That would have to be reported to us by distributors, and tracking all of these weapons and being able to. I think it's completely unrealistic to look at every single weapon or firearm that is being sold by Smith & Wesson and their distributors, and making sure that every single one of those weapons, those firearms, ends up in the right hands, because there's all these illegal processes and smuggling and illegal trafficking that occurs, and that is just way far out of the scope of Smith & Wesson as a manufacturing company to oversee.
But suppose you added extra safeguards, like tracing numbers or sales limitations, but criminals still manage to divert these guns. So how would that change your liability?
Thank you, Your Honor, for your question. So if a criminal is still buying a firearm from a retail shop legally, that transaction is legal. The criminal misuse of the product is illegal. Smith & Wesson cannot oversee the actions that a consumer takes with their firearm. They can only sell to licensed distributors. There's no other measures that can be taken. This would be a problem for the U.S. and Mexican government, who can actually regulate law and put legislation in place to change any types of straw purchasing or different types of purchasing that enhance smuggling.
Yeah, I just think the real issue here that Smith & Wesson really wants to emphasize is that Smith & Wesson, obviously, nobody really wants these weapons to end up in the wrong hands. Nobody wants firearms to be in the wrong hands. Nobody wants violent acts to be committed, illegal violent acts to be committed by these firearms. But the issue is not Mexico. They can't solve this issue by suing an American manufacturing company who has all legal processes. We need to look at better solutions, like improving the diplomatic relations between Mexico and the United States, improving the border control, because as we've mentioned, there's only one firearm store in Mexico. So that means that any weapons, any firearms that are entering Mexico are being illegally trafficked. So improving the border control between Mexico and the United States would be a better solution. Looking at the distributors and tracking all these weapons, I just don't think that the solution to this issue is suing an American manufacturing company and saying that their manufacturing and marketing of firearms is directly linked to the cartel violence in Mexico.
Does your team believe that the PLCAA provides immunity in cases where manufacturers are alleged to have knowingly facilitated illegal arms trafficking?
Could you clarify that one more time?
So does your team believe that the PLCAA provides immunity in cases where manufacturers are alleged to have knowingly facilitated illegal arms trafficking?
Yes, so in a case where a manufacturer knowingly sold the weapon or firearm to a consumer who is involved in the trafficking business or trafficking processes, that would be the case. The PLCAA would not apply, but in this case, Smith & Wesson has no involvement with the end user, and they do not know that the end user will smuggle the firearm into Mexico. So it's it's baseless to assume that Smith & Wesson would knowingly sell to an end user when there's so many exchanges of the weapon from the distributor to the retail shop to then the consumer.
But if this is such a problem, doesn't Smith & Wesson already know that this is already being misused and being smuggled?
Yes, I do see, I think you're right, I do see where you're coming from, but again, as I highlighted earlier in an earlier question, Smith & Wesson cannot oversee every single transaction or legal activity that is taken within their company as they are the manufacturers. So obviously any single average person in this country would know that there are these cartels in Mexico who are committing violent crimes, and a lot of those violent crimes are with American weapons. But again, they cannot just be held, Smith & Wesson would not be the only party held liable for all this violence committed by these drug cartels, because Smith & Wesson, as a manufacturing company, cannot oversee every single transaction that is occurring legally within the United States.
Thank you. We will now hear argument from the respondents. Ms. Amar?
Madam Chief Justice, and may it please the Court. For years, Mexico has faced a deadly crisis as between 342,000 and 597,000 firearms have been trafficked from the United States and into Mexico and armed violent cartels that terrorize communities and threaten national security. This crisis is not accidental. It is the foreseeable result of deliberate decisions made by U.S. gun manufacturers who must be held liable for their role in enabling this violence. This case is not about the lawful sale of firearms. It is about the corporations that knowingly facilitate illegal gun trafficking for profit. Petitioners flood the market with firearms, supply dealers with long histories of selling to traffickers, and even design and market weapons to appeal to criminal organizations. These reckless business practices are not merely negligent, they directly fuel cartel violence. For over 2 decades, petitioners have been warned by U.S. law enforcement and regulatory agencies that their firearms are being funneled into the hands of criminals. Yet, they continue supplying to these high-risk dealers. Due to their ignorance, nearly 80% of firearms recovered from crime scenes in Mexico can be traced back to these manufacturers. The petitioners now invoke the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act to shield themselves from liability. However, the First Circuit correctly held that their actions fall within the PLCAA's predicate exception clause. This law permits lawsuits when firearm manufacturers violate laws governing gun sales and distribution. Here, the petitioners knowingly enabled and profited from illegal trafficking in violation of these laws. Their conduct is the proximate cause of widespread death and destruction. This court has repeatedly affirmed that corporations cannot evade liability when they facilitate unlawful conduct. In Sandy Hook v. Remington, the court held that the gun manufacturers could be liable when their marketing contributed to foreseeable violence. Similarly, cases against Purdue Pharma and Johnson & Johnson refused to establish immunity for corporations that profited from the opioid crisis. Gun manufacturers must be held to the same standard. The law does not protect corporations that prioritize profits over human lives. It is time for them to be held accountable and for the voices of innocent civilians to be heard. Thank you. We now welcome the court's questions.
This issue crosses borders, and so under what precedent supports a foreign government suing U.S. companies for harm that occurs outside the United States?
Sorry, could you repeat that question?
Because this issue crosses nation borders, what precedent supports a foreign government suing the U.S. for harm that happens outside of the United States?
Sure. So we can take a look at U.S. versus. We can look at USA versus Noriega, and in that case, the dictator of Panama was brought to U.S. courts and sued for his involvement in narcotics and
other drug trafficking charges. So in the same way, Mexico can sue the U.S. for their gun manufacturers and their involvement in the trafficking of the firearms.
Justice Thomas?
Can you show that Smith & Wesson failed to meet the normal industry standards or how they've acted recklessly?
Sure. I would just also like to address the fact that this lawsuit isn't only against Smith & Wesson, it's against 7 other companies, some of which are also distributors.
These include Glock, Colt LLC, Beretta USA Corp., Stern Roger and Company, Barrett Firearms Manufacturing, the Century International Arms, and the Whitmer Public Safety Group via the Interstate Arms. So this lawsuit does include 2 distributors as well.
Yes, so, can you repeat the second part of the question?
Can you show that Smith & Wesson failed to meet normal industry standards or how they've acted recklessly?
Yeah, so in 2011, the Federal Bureau, the Department of Justice and the American Firearms, Tobacco, and Explosive Department found that they flagged a bunch of distributors that were selling illegally to smugglers and cartels. And so we know that these companies have been made aware of the fact that these distributors are participating in illegal activities, yet they continue to sell to these distributors.
I'd also like to add the fact that many of the gun manufacturing companies have been designing and marketing weapons specifically to cater to Mexican cartels.
So, if you're saying it's designed towards the cartels, are you essentially saying that does the name or design or product alone prove the intent?
The fact that, I'll give you 2 examples. One of the most prominent examples is the Emiliano Zapata pistol, which is a gun that depicts the Mexican Revolutionary War hero, Emiliano Zapata, and it has a quote from him, which states, "It is better to die trying than to die on your knees." So the fact that they are creating guns with these images and these quotes does prove that they are trying to cater toward a certain audience. And the petitioners...
Do you think that type of writing and those images, don't you think that it could also be, referencing Mexican American or Mexican independence and supporting that instead of referencing cartels?
Well, if you're saying that these gun companies are trying to cater to Mexican Americans, why don't they also cater to African Americans or Italian Americans or other demographic groups? Why just Mexican Americans? Could it possibly have to do with the fact that there are Mexican cartels who make a large percentage of their profits currently?
And if we look at ATF reports, a majority of the guns that have been created to cater to Mexican cartels, they are mainly found at crime scenes in Mexico. So there's not...
Are you alleging that the manufacturers are using specific design features or marketing strategies to deliberately facilitate gun trafficking into Mexico?
Yes, we are.
So these ATF warnings that you state, can you cite specifically what these warnings say and when they've happened?
So in the briefs that we provided, we have specifically stated when these ATF warnings have happened. But over the past couple of years, many gun manufacturers have been notified by the ATF. And what they do is that they red flag the distributors that these gun manufacturers sell to, and they notify these gun manufacturers that these distributors may be involved in some sort of illegal trafficking because of the sheer amount of guns that they purchase and the fact that the guns that they sell are found in crime scenes. And gun manufacturers are also able to track where the guns that they sell, they end up. So these gun manufacturers know that a lot of their guns are ending up in Mexico in crime scenes. And they still have yet to do anything about it.
Justice Alito?
So how do you respond to arguments that firearms with Mexican designs and names are intended to appeal to Mexican Americans?
Like I mentioned a little bit earlier, why are we saying that they are catering only to, specifically to Mexican Americans? I mean, if they wanted to increase their profits by catering to certain demographics, then they would expand it to other demographics like African Americans or Italian Americans or other groups, but they're specifically choosing to target Mexican Americans in this case, and that seems a little fishy to me, considering Mexican cartels generate over $170 million in profits for them.
Justice Sotomayor.
So we think that these manufacturers are directly fueling cartel violence, but under Wesson versus the U.S., aiding and abetting requires right consent. How does selling to local distributors, in Smith and Wesson's case specifically, meet that standard?
So when it comes to it, this court has held in CSX v. Transportation Inc. in 2011 that a company's actions does not need to cause direct harm, it just needs to cause foreseeable harm. And that is the case in this scenario. The fact that they are continuing to sell to these red flag dealers, knowing that these distributors are then selling to the illegal gun trafficking trade. That does portray that they foreseeable harm, because they know that if they sell to people that may be involved in the gun trafficking trade, these guns are gonna end up with cartels.
Smith and Wesson has stated that they only sell to distributors with that are federally licensed.
Well, Smith and Wesson has already been found liable for selling to distributors they know sell to illegal smugglers, but additionally, like we mentioned, this lawsuit is not just against Smith and Wesson, it's against 7 other companies, and 2 of these companies have their own distribution centers, and one of them has just acquired in 2019 one of USA's largest distributors.
Thank you.
Justice Kagan. What legal basis allows for the application of U.S. law to hold American companies accountable for actions that have effects in foreign countries?
So the PLCAA actually falls apart under international law, because according to the UN Charter, which both the USA and Mexico have agreed to, the U.S. cannot impose its laws, including the PLCAA, on Mexico's legal matters to prevent Mexico from seeking justice under its own legal framework. And so the Supreme Court in the U.S. has already affirmed federal statutes that do not apply outside the U.S., has claimed that federal statutes do not apply outside of U.S. territory until Congress explicitly states otherwise. And in the case of the PLCAA, there's no such provision, so that means that Mexico has every right to sue the United States in the court.
You mentioned that the ATF flagged certain distributors that Smith & Wesson and other companies are selling to. Does it state anywhere that manufacturers must stop selling to these distributors?
Yes, so currently under federal law, under the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, it is currently federally illegal to sell to straw purchasers. And in this case, the distributors that are selling to, that are being a part of the illegal gun trafficking trade, they are the straw purchasers that are buying these guns in bulk. So yes, it is illegal to sell to these distributors.
These distributors are not, these manufacturers are selling to the distributors, not directly to the straw purchasers.
Right, but the fact that they are selling to red flag distributors that have been known to be facilitated in this trade proves that they know what they are doing.
Well, my question is, does it state anywhere that they must stop selling to these red flag distributors?
These distributors are red flag because of the fact that they condone straw purchases. They repeatedly buy guns in bulk, and they continue to do so, and that is illegal. So according to federal law, yes, they cannot be selling to these red flag dealers.
But that is illegal for the distributors to
No, it is illegal for manufacturers under the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act.
And it is saying they cannot sell to straw purchasers. That is not what is happening in this case. They are selling directly to manufacturers, and after that, they have nothing to do with where those guns go.
The distributors in this case are the straw purchasers that the gun manufacturers are selling to, Your Honor.
And also some of these companies, like we said, have their own distribution centers. They are distributors.
Justice Gorsuch.
So the PLCAA prohibits civil suits against federally licensed manufacturers and sellers of firearms to pay for injuries caused by criminals' unlawful misuse of their lawful products. If this is not prohibited within our own borders, the United States borders, why would we make an exception and allow another country to sue a firearms manufacturer in the United States? In other words, why would there be an exception to this?
So the PLCAA was enacted in order to protect gun manufacturers from civil lawsuits in the cases where individuals may cause harm upon people and those same individuals may sue the gun manufacturers for the guns that they made, and that is not the case here. This PLCAA does also have a predicate exception clause where if gun manufacturers knowingly facilitate an illegal action, then they can be held liable under the PLCAA. So it does include that clause as well.
And like I mentioned earlier, the PLCAA only applies to U.S. affairs, but like I said, it falls apart when it's international. So Mexico has every right under the UN Charter to sue the United States on this basis.
And then going off of that, why is a lawsuit in the United States courts the appropriate mechanism to address this issue, rather than, say, an international treaty or other diplomatic solutions?
So if Mexico tried to hold these gun manufacturers accountable in either an international treaty or in Mexico's own courts, there's no promise that these laws would be upheld by these manufacturers. They may just choose to not uphold the laws because it's a Mexican law, and they may just claim ignorance as well. Again.
Justice Kavanaugh?
Even if your lawsuit succeeds, how would the financial damages or increased U.S. firearm regulations meaningfully reduce cartel violence in Mexico? Because Mexico already has strict gun laws, yet it seems that your cartels are often more armed than your law enforcement. Shouldn't the larger focus be on the Mexican government failure to control illegal firearm circulation?
So we would use the money from this lawsuit to, obviously there was a lot of damage that was done, which is why we are bringing this lawsuit up. There was 450 federal officers that were killed due to cartel violence from these manufactured guns. So we would like to obviously get those federal officers back and increase security at the border.
Additionally, I would like to include the fact that Mexico does recognize that the fact that gun violence is very prevalent, and it has taken a lot of measures. For example, at the USA-Mexico borders, it has taken away civilian jobs and implemented military control in the major checkpoints, and it has also implemented canine units and X-ray technologies. That way we can, in order to find these guns and get rid of them faster, we're also trying to build the influence of the military as well.
Additionally, Mexico has, like you sort of mentioned, really strict gun laws. There's only one legal gun store in the entire country, and that's owned by the Mexican military, and they only issued 50 permits last year. And the only reason that Mexican cartels have to go to the U.S. manufacturers to get guns is because they can't buy them as frequently in Mexico.
Thank you.
Justice Coney Barrett?
So in the brief, you stated that your client is seeking billions of dollars in damages. Can you please outline how they have come to that conclusion that billions of dollars is a sufficient amount for the damages done?
So, as we kind of stated a little bit in this question, the billions of dollars is kind of to combat the damages that have occurred due to this gun violence, kind of helping out the families of victims, and also just to build up our military and help to combat the government as well, just so that we can combat this illegal gun trafficking trade. We are also internally trying to combat it with agencies in these cartels, but the $1 billion that we have asked for, that would also help with that, and would also strengthen border patrol.
Additionally, I would like to say that this is not just a Mexican issue, this is an American issue as well. When these cartels get their hands on these guns, they set up and reinforce their drug trafficking networks, and that has led to the fentanyl and opioid crisis in the United States. The Biden administration recognized this lateral exchange, and they have said that they will take measures to, with Mexico to get this problem under control, but nothing has been taken. And a lawsuit like this will set that precedent to show that you cannot keep making these mistakes, you cannot keep costing people their lives because you want to maximize your profits.
Know that this is just for guns. They say that, or Smith & Wesson says that their liability and their responsibility ends at the distributor. So does this not mean that entry of guns into Mexico is a Mexico Border Patrol issue and not really Smith & Wesson as a manufacturer issue?
No. So as I kind of stated before, the manufacturers are able to track the sales, and they are made aware when the guns that they sell are found in Mexican crime scenes, and as well as the fact that the ATF and the Department of Justice are continuing to tell them which distributors they should not be selling to, and they are continuing to sell to these distributors. So they should be held liable because they know what is going on, and they are not doing anything to stop it. In fact, they are continuing to sell even more guns each year. And Mexico has recognized its own faults. Like I said before, they have implemented a lot of border control measures, but those border control measures can only be upheld when when guns coming into Mexico are decreased. And the fact that they're coming in sheer thousands of volumes, it's just not realistic in order to regulate all of them.
Justice Jackson?
So, how are you proving that the gun companies are helping the traffickers rather than just doing their job and selling the guns legally?
So, like I said kind of before, they are knowingly selling to these distributors. They are aware that these distributors are selling to, or they're aware that the guns that they're selling to these distributors are ending up in Mexican crime scenes that are being used by Mexican cartels. So the fact that they know this and they are not doing anything to stop this kind of proves that they are also facilitating in this illegal trade.
And how can you prove if the manufacturers stop selling to these alleged red flag dealers, it would lessen the gun violence that is so common in Mexico?
Yeah, so the ATF data from 2004 clearly shows that after this federal ban on assault weapons was lifted, in regions that border the Mexican border where the ban was lifted, there was an increase in the death toll of Mexican lives by over 50 to 100,000 additional deaths. So we know that by regulating the guns, then there will be less deaths. But if you continue to allow things to continue as they have been going, then people will keep dying.
So how do you distinguish this case from any other industry where products are sometimes misused? And an example could be the car industry.
I don't really know much about the car industry, but we can take a look at Twitter v. Tamna, where Twitter was sued for basically helping terrorists use their platform to promote terroristic ideas. But I would say this case is different because Twitter was an open platform and they don't really have much say about who's using their algorithm and how. But in this case, the manufacturers, who are also distributors, know exactly who they are selling to, and despite warnings from the ATF and the Department of Justice to sell to these flag purchasers, they continue to do so, and they know that their practices are costing thousands of lives, but they continue to do so.
I would also like to add the fact, the case against Purdue Pharma and Johnson & Johnson, where the courts held these companies liable for continuing to flood the market with opioids despite knowing that they were being misused and illegally distributed. So these courts ruled that Purdue did have a responsibility to monitor and prevent excessive supply, and that is the same case here. These gun manufacturers have a responsibility to stop selling to red flag dealers and just operate on a legal basis.
So the PLCAA has some very narrow exceptions. So which specific part of the law in the PLCAA are you relying to say immunity doesn't apply here?
The predicate exception clause.
And what exact regulation or statute do you believe Smith & Wesson has violated? And do you have any evidence to prove this?
Yes, so like I kind of said before, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which states that you cannot, it is federally illegal to sell to straw purchasers, and the fact that these distributors are straw purchasers buying these guns in bulk, and they continue to sell to red flag dealers, that is an indication of wrongdoing.
So do you suggest to this court that we override a statute that was specifically designed to protect lawful gun commerce, and especially when criminals are the primary wrongdoers?
So we are not asking that you override the statute. We understand why it was put in place in order to protect the gun manufacturers, but these gun manufacturers cannot hide behind the PLCAA when they are condoning illegal activities. We are citing the predicate exception clause, which permits lawsuits when these gun manufacturers knowingly facilitate an illegal action, and that is what's happening here.
How would you respond to concerns that a ruling in your favor may set a precedent for foreign nations to sue U.S. companies for various harms, potentially leading to extensive litigation?
So We are only suing these multitude of gun manufacturers because of the fact that they are knowingly facilitating an illegal activities. There would be no outlet for foreign nations to sue other companies or gun manufacturers in general if they operate on a legal basis. So if they continue to operate legally, they should be fine. But if they are continuing to operate illegally, then they should be held accountable no matter which country they are in. And it should not be the fact that if it's a different country, they can't sue. And we've seen in numerous cases where the United
And
States...
those different nations can sue on laws that are inside the United States.
I'm
Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I am. So it shouldn't be that, like she was saying, it shouldn't be that the foreign nations cannot sue, and it would not set the precedent that foreign nations will be continuing to sue. They will only be able to sue, and these lawsuits will only pass if these companies are operating illegally. So if they operate legally, then they should be okay.
Thank you, counsel. The case is submitted.